Have you ever wondered why true crime or dark, macabre, chilling events are fascinating? Well, I believe that some of us are hardwired to survive, and that wiring urges us to seek out information and share stories of events that others would consider unsettling. Perhaps you get a rush when you hear a tale about a horrific event, but really it's the insight about how to survive if ever the situation happened to you. And thankfully, that knowledge will help you feel empowered to make choices to keep yourself safe. This is my goal. Hello, my lovelies, and thank you for joining me. I'm Madame Roman. I discuss true crime, dark histories, mysteries, and mayhem, and anything else that fascinates me. Sometimes I take a look at things in a different perspective. I like to delve into the possibilities of why things happen and why people do things. So if that's something that also interests you, put on your highest red-bottom slippers and get ready to learn how to strut your stuff down the silver brick road to the land of wisdom. The following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. So if you're not mature, step the fuck out of line, because this shit is about to get real. And if you haven't already, please support the channel and like and subscribe. This story begins on a cold, dark November night in 1957. It was the first day of hunting season. Officers were at the house of a local lonely bachelor that lived there by himself in the big, isolated farm since the death of his mother. They were there to check on the whereabouts of another local, a businesswoman that had gone missing earlier that day. There was a real urgency to locate her, as her son believed she could be in mortal trouble. The man who lived at the house was believed to be the last person to have seen her. The house was not kept up in recent years. It was old and worn, with overgrown hedges, paint peeling, and the land had not been worked in decades. The officers entered through the summer kitchen. There was what we would call today's standards: indoor plumbing, heating, or telephones, or TV, just a potbelly stove. Without electricity, the police officers used their flashlights to see their way carefully through the junk that littered the floor. Books, cans, boxes, tools, clothes. It was a total hoarder situation. In the total darkness, with sight diminished, their senses heightened, and the smell of trash and what most experienced hunter would know to be decomposition, they must have had the inkling of a dreadful situation they had come upon. They were so focused on not losing their footing that when something from above brushed the shoulder of the sheriff, it startled him. As the sheriff turned his flashlight to the object, he was shocked to see what he first thought was a dressed deer hanging from the rafters after a recent successful day of hunting. But to his horror, he realized that the form was not that of a deer. With astonishment and horror, the words, "My God, here she is," exited his mouth. The nude body of a woman was hanging by the ankles, upside down, legs spread. She had been slit from the pelvis to sternum, disemboweled, blood drained, and head missing. The officers, horrified at the sight, ran out of the house and vomited. August 27, 1906, Edward Theodore Gein was born to Georgia and Augusta Gein. This makes him a Virgo sun, the Virgin, and as you will see later, right on the nose on that one. As an earth sign, Virgo is a perfectionist at heart and isn't afraid to improve skills through diligence and consistent practice. In his birth chart, it is accurate to say that he was shy, kind of a wallflower, analytical, and hardworking with a strong sense of fairness and equality. The main source of self-worth is being respected and appreciated by others, rather than having the maturity to self-regulate. He would have had a propensity to dwell on the fear of underperforming and negative outcomes. So, on the mark for this one. But before we talk about Ed, we should start with his parents first. Augusta, his mother, was one of 8 children, born to German immigrant parents. Her parents were Old Lutheran, a conservative sect that did not approve of the change in the doctrine. They had fled Europe because of religious, social, and political unrest. They believed that every human thought and deed was infected in sin, and all of humanity deserved eternal damnation. Augusta had become a very self-assured young woman. She never doubted herself, and with her parents' teaching of hard work, thriftiness, and self-denial, she had the confidence and belief she could overcome anything. Her parents were strict, with bad behavior from the children resulted in beatings. Augusta was shown very little affection, so she wasn't primed for healthy relationships. Augusta married George in 1899 when she was 19 and George was 24. They had similarities and perhaps thought that this was enough to accomplish the expected marriage and procreation goals society and their families had set for them. George was also descended from German immigrant parents. However, while riding into town in a buggy, there were heavy rains that flooded the river and drowned his father, mother, and sister. He was just 3 years old. He was then raised by his grandparents, who were also strict Lutherans and not very affectionate. They believed affection was a sign of weakness. George worked as a carpenter, tanner, and for the La Crosse City power plant as a young man. But he found more and more that drinking alcohol was to his liking. Please drink responsibly. For whatever reason, George lacked self-esteem and self-respect, and perhaps he saw marriage with Augusta as comfortable. After all, Augusta was a take charge, get shit done kind of person. He would never have to worry about the responsibility of having to make any big decisions because he knew Augusta would handle it. And that would give him the confirmation bias that he needed to keep himself in bitterness and self-pity. He took out his aggravation on Augusta by beating her. In her religious devotion, she did not believe in divorce, not to mention the stigma of such a thing. So she decided that perhaps a child would improve the relationship, and she consented to procreation with George. I say procreation because she detested sexual activity. In 1902, their first child, Henry, was born, but Augusta believed that this was punishment from God. She had desperately wanted a daughter, and she could not bond with him. When their second child, Ed, was born, she decided that because she did not have a girl that she wanted, she would mold the two sons into better men than their father. George had become a despondent, pathetic alcoholic who beat her and the boys when his temper from drinking and self-hatred became too much for him. Augusta had to find jobs for him because he didn't like to work and couldn't hold one down. She had to support their family with the grocery store that she owned in La Crosse. They began to hate and resent him. But by 1914, when Ed was 8 years old, Augusta decided that La Crosse was no longer a good place for the family. She believed that it was a big city that had turned into a Sodom and Gomorrah, full of sin and debauchery. She believed that the women were harlots with their short skirts, hair in waves, and makeup. Now remember, there was a huge fashion change since her childhood. Women went from full-length, neck to feet covered, dresses with corsets and layers to, well, eventually the 20s, flapper styles. Short hair, shoulders and knees bare, and no corsets. And the men were no better. They were all bad for wanting these harlots. I myself proudly claim the harlot from hell nomenclature, without apology. Of course, my guess is the change was because George had a wandering eye. The little devil of an eye probably wandered right under the bed of some pretty little harlot, if not more than once. Likely, Augusta had had enough. She believed that Plainfield, Wisconsin would be a better place for her family. The town was very small, 600 to 700 people, mostly poor but hardworking. The farm was over 150 acres and a bit outside of the town. Unfortunately, the soil in the area was sandy and difficult to work. The other farmers in the town did not offer to help teach Augusta and George how to work the land for the best yield. The townspeople also regarded them as outsiders, as people in small towns often do. This made the family feel alienated. This, coupled with the fact that there was no Lutheran church, led Augusta to believe that the people from town were not charitable or kind, that they were bad and not worthy of association. In reaction to her, locals felt she seemed superior, self-righteous, and too good for them. The boys were only allowed to go off the farm for school, which was a one-room schoolhouse with 12 other students. There, Ed was bullied for his lazy eye, which was actually just a growth on his eyelid that made his lid droop a little. He also had a growth on his tongue that made his speech a little off. But his worst sin was that he had an effeminate nature, and God forbid a boy have feminine mannerisms. But Ed was an avid and prolific reader. He loved to read, mostly adventure stories. It may have helped him escape in daydream, leading to unexpected laughter in class. Every day after school, Augusta would tell Bible stories, stories about the evils of drinking and women. George? She would tell Old Testament stories about graphic death, murder, and divine retribution, and the flood with water washing out the sin of women. Because Augusta believed that the townspeople were without morals, the boys were not allowed to socialize. They had no friends, and Ed would be berated for wanting to make friends. He was told that associations with them would lead to him making bad decisions and that he would become a loser like his father. Dang. Augusta also stuck to her belief that sex was a sin. She told them that it was a sinful damnation and that they should remain virgins. When Ed was 7 or 8 years old, he snuck into the slaughter shed where Augusta and George were about to slaughter a pig. From his hiding spot, he could see Augusta slice the pig's belly open and remove all its intestines, and at that moment, Ed ejaculated at the sight. With puberty, Ed started to want to become a powerful woman like his mother, rather than a weak failure like his father. Ed completed school at the 8th grade and started working on the farm full-time, as well as doing odd jobs around town. But in 1940, at age 66, after 3 years in an invalid state, George died of heart failure caused by alcoholism. During those 3 years, Augusta, Henry, and Ed, the people who resented him most, had to care for him. Side note, George had stopped drinking for several years prior to his death, so, 66 is pretty old for 1940, but it's still a little sus. With George's death, the boys had to pick up more odd jobs off the farm. They both were known as dependable and hardworking, but because he was more capable with manual labor, Henry learned how to be more social and had more opportunities off the farm. Ed was smaller and considered odd, but trustworthy. He babysat the children of local families, and the kids liked him, and he found that they were easier to relate to than adults. 4 years after the death of their father, Henry started to defy Augusta. He began dating a divorced mother of 2 and even started making plans to move in with her. This must have driven Augusta into a frenzy of anger and frustration. He also started to criticize Augusta to Ed, calling her a crazy shrew, and suggesting that her relationship with Ed was too close and he too dependent on her. This behavior was appalling to Ed, who considered Augusta his best friend. He idolized his mother, believed that she was the disciple of God and good in every way. He strove to be perfect in her eyes. May of that year, Ed ran to authorities to get help when he couldn't find his brother after a brush fire they had set got out of control. When the authorities followed Ed, he led them right to Henry's body. He was laying face down on scorched earth, but he was untouched by flames. They did see that he had a head wound. When the authorities asked Ed about not knowing where his brother was, but leading them right to his body, Ed said, "How funny that works." Henry's death was ruled a heart attack while fighting the fire, and he hit his head while falling. There was no autopsy, even though some suspected foul play, but nothing was done. No investigation or charges were filed because they felt Ed wasn't capable of anything malicious. Maybe Augusta should have mentioned the story of Cain and Abel in the field, rising up against the brother. The punishment from God is pretty severe. After Henry's death, Ed and Augusta were finally alone. Well, until Augusta suffered a stroke that left her an invalid. But Ed took this as an opportunity. He could prove how capable he was of taking care of her, how worthy a person he was by nursing her back to health. And he did, but she started to raise concerns about his material that he was reading. True crime, grave robbings, adventures in the South Sea with shrunken heads, and books on anatomy. It was on one unfortunate day that things took a turn for the worse. Ed and Augusta went to a neighbor's farm for supplies for the remaining livestock. At the Smith's farm, Mr. Smith was beating a puppy mercilessly. Smith's girlfriend came out of the house yelling at the cruelty, begging Smith to stop, but he would not relent, and he beat the poor puppy to death. But it was not the beating of the puppy that upset Ed's mother. It was the fact that the woman who came out of Smith's house was living with Smith outside of wedlock. She was livid at the audacity of the whore, living in sin and brazen about it in front of a God-fearing woman. Ed later said that he believed it was this incident that led to Augusta's second stroke. On December 29, 1945, Augusta died at the age of 67. Ed was inconsolable and distraught, wailing at his mother's funeral that was attended by few people. He believed it was the death of his one true love. Ed's world was devastated. Without any self-identity, self-control, or autonomy to his life, he deteriorated mentally and physically. He did not know how to make decisions on his own, and his moral compass was quickly diminishing into fantasy. Ed boarded up all the rooms just as his mother had left them, as a shrine of sorts. He lived in only the 2 remaining rooms. For lack of funds and will, the farm and he started to go into shambles. He became mentally unbalanced, reading about Isla Koch, who is said to have used the skins of Nazi concentration camp prisoners as lampshades. He continued to read all kinds of material that Augusta had shown concern about, and added stories of sexual mutilation as well. He began living in filth and squalor. Within 1 year of her death, locals began to notice his bad hygiene and deterioration. They would treat him with disdain, making him the butt of jokes. The house had become haunted, and the children would run past, not for the fear of Ed, but the fear of the house. Ed became overcome by his imagination. 12 years after Augusta's death, in 1957, Bernice Warden, a 58-year-old widow and owner of a local hardware store, opened her store at 8 a.m. By 9:30, locals noticed the store had been locked up, but Bernice was known to do this when she ran an errand. By about 5 p.m., when her son, Deputy Frank Warden, returned from deer hunting for the day, he went into the store and saw the register missing. Behind the counter, a .22 shell casing and a pool of blood, with a trail of blood that led to where the store truck usually was parked behind the store. It was then that he knew his mother was murdered. Looking for any clues, Frank went to the receipt ledger and saw the morning's receipts. There was a purchase for antifreeze by Ed Gein. Ed had been hanging around the store for several weeks, asking Bernice if she would like to go roller skating with him. Bernice had declined, likely because she thought she was too old for that kind of thing. Ed had been in the day before the disappearance, asking about the price of antifreeze. While there, Ed asked Frank if he would be gone the next day, Saturday, for the first day of hunting season. Frank confirmed that he wouldn't be there, and Ed left, stating that he would be back the next day to purchase the antifreeze. A witness stated that they saw the store truck leave about 9:30 that morning, but couldn't tell who was driving. Frank immediately contacted his superior, the sheriff, that his mother had been murdered, and that he thought Ed Gein was responsible. After the discovery of the body at Ed's house, criminalists, techs, and investigators descended on Plainfield to thoroughly go through the house. They set up a generator for lights in order to work through the dark, cold night. The macabre task of sifting through trash and human remains was overwhelming. In between two mattresses, they found a burlap sack with steam rising from it. The officer opened the sack and was horrified when he pulled out the head of Bernice Warden. Her eyes were closed and she looked like she was sleeping. However, there were metal nails protruding out of each ear that had been bent to form hooks that twine had been attached to make a loop as if to hang the head. Her intestines were found in a box in the corner. In this hideous house of horrors, investigators found lampshades, chairs, and a wastebasket made from human skin. There were bowls made from the tops of skulls that Ed had likened to Norwegian-style songs to drink mead from. There were jars of women's fingernails, a belt of nipples, a box of female genitalia under the bed, some of them painted silver to maintain their natural color, with red bows and sprinkled with salt for preservation. There was also a jar of noses, a lampshade pole made of lips, bones used as legs for a coffee table, utensil handles made of bone, skulls on the bedposts, a .32 pistol, among other weapons, 9 face masks, 5 heads, 4 skulls, and a partridge in a pear tree. And then they found the complete face and hair of a woman named Mary Hogan, who had been missing for almost 3 years. When Ed was not found at his home, it was suggested that officers try Lester Hill's house. Ed was known to buy groceries at their store. Earlier that day, Ed had an unusually quick chat with Elmo Eek, while Ed changed the tires of his car from winter to summer. In November. Sus. Then Bill Hill, Lester's teenage son, asked Ed to run him into town for an auto battery for Lester. Ed agreed, but he had to wash his hands first since they were covered in blood. So, did he answer the door with his hands covered in blood? And then Ed had dinner with them, as he was frequent to do. They had pork chops, potatoes, mac and cheese, coffee, and cookies, and he played games with one of the children. I hope he didn't provide the meat. The Hills liked Ed. Irene, the wife and mother, knew Ed from school days. He liked to watch TV at their house. He was known to bring the children candy and play games with them. He often babysat for them. Ed had invited the children over to his house on several occasions to have soup, teach them the accordion, and show off his shrunken heads that he got from his cousin in the Philippines who served in World War II. One of the children even spied the face masks complete with lipstick that were hanging in his bedroom, which he said he got through the mail. And of course, they had no idea that the bowls that the soup was being served in were made from human skulls. Initially, Ed claimed that he had been framed and that he had nothing to do with the murder of Bernice. Even with the knowledge of the fact that Bernice's body was found in such a horrendous manner in his home, he refused to claim responsibility. It wasn't until he was taken and shown Bernice's body that he finally confessed. But he would not talk until he was given a piece of apple pie with cheese on top. I know the saying, don't knock until you try it, but some things I don't need to try in order to know that it's going to taste like shit. With the consumption of the piece of pie, he confessed that he killed Bernice in her store on accident. He claimed that he remembered holding the rifle and loading it with a shell that he happened to have in his pocket, and it must have discharged because he didn't remember. He had no memory of putting the body in a truck, driving to the lover's lane, or taking Bernice's body to the house and butchering her. However, Ed claimed that her death was ordained and that she had gotten what she deserved. He said that she was an evil woman because it was rumored that she stole her husband from another girl and that girl had taken her life because of it. So if he did murder her, it was justified by God, according to Ed. When asked about if he practiced any sexual activities with the bodies, Ed denied it. The reason he had not committed any necrophilia was due to the fact that he thought they smelled really bad when referring to the bodies. Since the authorities had found the face of Mary Hogan, they questioned Ed about her disappearance. Maria Josephine Covan Hogan, or Mary as she was called, was born in Austria in 1901 and had immigrated to the U.S. with her father and sister at the age of 13. She was twice, maybe thrice divorced, woman with a child she had out of wedlock and abandoned. She was a hearty woman who was rowdy, foul-mouthed, with a thick accent. It was rumored that she had been a big city madam in Chicago and had associations with the mob. Side note, I recently watched the movie Burlesque from like 15 years ago. At the time it came out, I had heard all kinds of misogynist rantings about it, and like a good girl, I swallowed that shit whole. I recently saw it available to watch, and I decided to find out for myself what I thought. So I watched it. After learning that Mary may have been a madam, it reminded me of Cher's character. Not that she was a madam, but that she was this head big mama in charge with unshakable self-assurance and determination. It always warms my heart to see a woman confident and unapologetic about taking norms and standards and shoving them up society's ass. Especially when she has done everything right and played by the rules and finally realizes that society doesn't have her back, but would rather see her on it for its own profit and pleasure rather than her own. Sorry, ADHD moment. Mary had disappeared 3 years before, in 1954, from the bar she owned called Pine Grove Tavern. Ed was a frequent patron. She was known to keep the tavern closed during the day except to people she knew, so when the police were notified that she was missing, they suspected a local right away. They had found a cup of coffee, a chair tipped over, and a pool of blood on the floor. There was a .32 caliber casing, empty register, and most important, a fingerprint in blood. Not helpful without a suspect to compare it to at the time, but once Ed became a suspect, they confirmed that it was his print. Authorities took Ed to Mary's tavern, and he confessed to her death. He stated that he had cremated her body when he no longer had use for her. He would later recant his confession, saying that that's what the investigators wanted to hear. At the time of her disappearance, police had suspected that Mary had been carried out of the tavern, as there were no drag marks and she weighed over 200 pounds. With Ed as a suspect, investigators didn't think he could have committed the crime alone. There had been mention of a friend, Gus, that may have helped him, but he had become violently insane soon after Mary's disappearance and was committed to a mental institution, where he shortly died. It doesn't seem like the police pursued this much because the man had already died, so yeah. After Mary's disappearance, when the topic came up, Ed told local Elmo Eek that Mary wasn't missing. She was up at his house. Elmo dismissed this and nothing further was done. Ed was shrewd. He only confessed when he was not being recorded and never anything that there was no evidence for. His replies to relevant questions were calculated, guarded, and evasive. He claimed that he was in a daze and he couldn't remember, and he was unbalanced. He went so far as to tell one interrogator, "I think I've got them pretty good convinced. Anyway, I hope so," referring to the examining doctor who was tasked with evaluating his mental capacity. He readily, even eagerly, discussed his grave robbing crime and any crime he didn't think was legally serious or hold serious consequences. Ed explained that after 2 years of intense loneliness after the death of Augusta, he started to have visions and hallucinations of his mother's voice. He began digging up bodies at 3 local cemeteries. He first attempted to dig up his mother, but because her coffin was buried with a concrete vault on top, he was unsuccessful. He read the newspaper searching for local obituaries of deaths of middle-aged women that resembled his mother and dug them up the day they were buried. Some sources say that he dug up his mother and twisted her head off and shrunk it like was explained in the books he read. It was also said that he kept the body in his bed and would sleep with it at night, but this was not true. So don't believe it if you hear it. However, Ed did believe that with just his willpower, he could resurrect her. Not sure of the logistics there. Was she supposed to dig herself out like some kind of zombie movie? But there were no zombie movies at the time, so was he imagining people emerging from their graves before zombie movies? Was he the OG George Romero? He stated that he was disappointed when she didn't show up. Was she a no-show to his dinner plans? Like he had the table set and the candles lit and oh dang, what was he serving? Oh, by the way, Ed claimed that there was no cannibalism. He said that he did not like the sight of blood. Bob Lester did see him the day of Bernice Worden's murder with bloody hands, and he had to have handled the bloody bodies of his murder victims. Not to mention, police suspected that he slit Bernice's throat at the scene because of all the blood found. And as a deer hunter would know, this has to be done to maintain the quality of the meat. Why else would he do that? Historically, there have been many times where people resorted to cannibalism for survival, usually in winter and with no other resources. And he was obviously poor. He couldn't maintain the house or make essential updates like electricity for heating or plumbing for water. No bathroom. Someone said he gave out venison, but he wasn't a deer hunter. Perhaps he restricted himself to hunting only long pig. In a daze, Ed visited graveyards about 40 times in 10 years, but would wake up and go home. There were 9 times that he dug up graves. He claimed to have acted alone, and because the grave was freshly turned and apparently only about 2 feet deep with sandy soil, he could do it in one night. Investigators did eventually believe that he could rob the grave on his own. He did carry Augusta after her stroke from the car to her room by himself, but they were not convinced that all the remains in his home were solely from grave robbing. After all, the number of heads and skulls didn't match his claims. In order to prove whether Ed was a serial killer or grave robber, detectives considered opening some of the graves. In the community, this became hotly debated. Some did not want to disturb the dead anymore and just wanted to let the matter go. Authorities decided to open 3 graves and found confirmation of Ed's grave robbing story. Ed stated his grave robbing activities was because of a fascination with becoming a woman. He would dig up fresh graves to skin the women's bodies to make a female suit. Investigators found what he called his mammary vest, complete with breasts, leggings made from the skins of women, and female genitalia. There were gloves made out of the fingers and face masks made out of the faces of the women. He would oil them to try to keep them supple. It puts the lotion in the basket, or else it gets the hose again. He would don all these pieces to become a woman and wear it while grave robbing, or dancing in his yard under the full moon. Which really ticks me off, because dancing under the full moon in your birthday suit, in your privacy of your own land, is fucking awesome. But just make sure it's your own fucking suit. Police did wonder if Ed Gein had murdered more than he confessed to. He must have realized at some point that he needed fresh, young skin to make the perfect suit, and local natural deaths were not frequent enough. They thought grave robbing just wasn't going to supply enough skin. This theory was supported when among the female genitalia found, it was determined that 2 came from young girls about 15 years old. I do find it interesting that in 1957 they could determine how old someone was by a piece of salt-preserved flesh. The coroner's description of Bernice seemed a bit weird when describing her breasts. It was totally creepy. So anyway, this led to questions of other crimes that Ed might have committed. In October 1953, just a year before Mary's disappearance, 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley of La Crosse went missing while babysitting. There were signs of a struggle. Her glasses were broken, there was a bloody bra and panties, furniture in disarray, blood on the floor in the garage, and a trail to a waiting car. An intensive search was done, but no further information was found. It was determined that Ed was visiting his aunt in the area at the time of the abduction, and the girl's dress was found in his house. There was also the disappearance on May 1st, 1947, of Georgia Jean Weckler, an 8-year-old in Jefferson, Wisconsin. Georgia was last seen when she was dropped off from school by a neighbor, Mrs. Florick, at the end of her half-mile drive leading to her house. Her father reported her missing, and a huge search was conducted with no trace of Georgia other than a white Ford seen in the area at the time of her disappearance. However, this was 150 miles away from Plainfield, which made it unlikely that Ed had anything to do with it. Ed had only traveled once outside of the area to Milwaukee for a military exam during World War II, which he failed because of his eye. A suspect, Buford Sennett, confessed that he and an accomplice had taken and murdered the girl, but he later recanted the confession. Sennett remained the primary suspect, even after a white Ford was found on Ed's property after his arrest that no one knew he had. So sus. Police wanted to know about the other disappearances in the area as well. Victor Bunk Travis, 42, and Ray Burgess had gone to a local bar after a day of hunting. It was said that Burgess was flashing wads of cash and Gein had been there that day. It was speculated that perhaps some of Ed's crimes were committed as a need for money as well as his horrid desires. For instance, the empty register at Mary Hogan's Tavern, the stolen register from Bernice's store found in Ed's house, and the fact that he was the sole heir when his brother died. He also had sold part of the family farm for money and wanted to sell the whole thing and move somewhere sunny. After the disappearance, Ed had told a local that Travis had been killed by a neighbor. He even said that he could take the local to where Travis was buried, but the man dismissed him. When Ed was questioned, in light of his crimes, about the disappearance of the two men, he would say, "Oh, I don't remember. Oh, I don't know." Officers were not satisfied. The circumstances were too similar to Bernice and Mary, too close to home, although some believe there may have been a mafia link behind the disappearances. There were also the cases of James Walsh, 32, a neighbor of Ed Gein's. Ed would help the missing man's wife around the house after the man went missing. And Irene Keating, 30, who was last seen in Plainfield. Ed would take a lie detector test for her case, but the results were inconclusive. He was still not considered a serious suspect. I don't know why. Police had believed Ed was a serial killer at one point to account for all the remains that were in his house. But with the opening of the graves, they decided to drop further investigation into the discrepancies of the cases. Ed denied any connection to any other killings or disappearances. The authorities were satisfied with his lie detector test results, and the psychiatrist determined that Ed's main demographic was middle-aged women that resembled or were the antithesis of his mother. But it is worth mentioning, authorities and the community wanted a conclusion to this grisly case. Authorities were also not eager to continue spending money on cases not in the area. They kept stating, "We don't have anyone missing." After all the media attention that had been brought to the area by the crimes that Ed had committed and those that were speculated, it made the little town of Plainfield a circus of national and international attention. Okay, Pete's going to sit with us. Maybe for a minute. Maybe just for a minute. Not to mention the macabre tourists that wanted to see the House of Horrors. Despite most of the community eager to never hear of Ed Gein again, some townspeople were eager to talk to the press. There was an article about Adeline Watkins, 50, who had a 20-year romance with Gein and almost married him, which turned out to be exaggerated. Much like Ira Turner, who claimed that he was Ed's best friend and they hunted together, and that he spent so many dinners at Ed's house growing up that it was like his second home. That was not true. Then there were the teenagers that would party at Ed's house after his arrest, so much so that the local authorities began to complain that they could not pay for the cost to keep a guard at the house. And then, of course, society's way of dealing with many unbelievable, horrific events, humor. The Geiners started within days of the discovery of the body of Bernice. Would you lay down? This is society's way to deal with the invasion of trust and the horrific act of cannibalism, necrophilia, grave robbing, and a murder that had happened right in their community. What did Ed Gein say to the sheriff who arrested him? Have a heart. Why did Ed Gein crank up the heat? So the furniture wouldn't get goosebumps. And there is a whole rendition of Nightmare Before Christmas. Ed was eventually charged. Sorry. Peter, you're so silly. Ed was eventually charged with the murder of Bernice, which he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He most likely thought that if his mental stability was questionable, he would be given consideration, even eventual release, perhaps from previous cases of men committing murder, particularly the beheading of wives, and pleading insanity. An example was E. Ray Tompkins in Milwaukee in December 1923. He was a local high school teacher turned illegal real estate developer who choked and decapitated his wife in the apartment that he had developed. He had a history with authorities of threatening his wife and previously told her that he would have killed her if it had not been for the kids. But this was no longer a consideration when she confronted him about his affair with a student, who he would later state was his ray of sunshine and soulmate. When arrested, he thought he would get probation or a fine, and requested that he actually should be released to raise his children to be good citizens of the community. He pleaded guilty by reason of insanity and died in a mental institution in 1954. There was also the case of 65-year-old butcher Raymond Wilson. In November of 1954, Raymond killed and dismembered his 67-year-old wife, who was blind and invalid. They had been married less than a year after a short courtship, and her will had been adjusted just after their marriage to make him the sole beneficiary of her estate if she were to pass away. Sus. He would claim insanity because he found her dead in a wheelchair and claimed he blacked out, so he did not remember dismembering her and trying to stuff her body parts down a drain. He also at one point claimed that she had consented to being killed, so of course he was just only obliging her. So how does that conversation start? Oh, sweetheart, can you pass me the peas? Oh, and hit me over the head with a meat cleaver while you're up? Which he was a butcher and admitted doing. Again, one wonders if the evidence went out with the locals, sold by the pound in paper brown packages wrapped with twine. Wilson was found sane after examination by psychologists or alienists. Eventually, when the judge was not buying his excuses and attempt to evade justice for killing his wife, he was asked point blank, "I'm asking you whether you killed your wife." It seems in exasperation he answered, "All right, I killed my wife." Unfortunately for Raymond, he was found guilty and would not inherit her estate because he was convicted of her murder. No get-out-of-jail-free card. No collecting $200. Yay! Somebody did believe his shit. So, Ed played his hand at the insanity defense and was found mentally incompetent and unfit to stand trial by examining doctors. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic personality with neurotic manifestations. He was mentally immature and aggressively impulsive with a strong feminine identification. Because of his strong religious beliefs, he had a tendency to blame others for evil. Ed also blamed the townspeople for his behavior and actions, stating that had they been nicer or treated him more fairly and not taken advantage of his kindness and had more appreciation for the things he did for them, he would not have done the things he had. He consistently blamed others for his actions rather than examining his own shortcomings, which is an affliction of many still to this day. He also couldn't form relationships with others because of his awkwardness, shyness, self-righteousness, and contempt toward them. Total incel before computers. The townspeople reacted to the insanity determination with outrage and anger. They believed he knew what he was doing, and he duped the doctors. This combined with the planned auction of his property, including his house that had brought hordes of macabre tourists, was too much. There had been talk of someone purchasing the house and turning it into a horrific museum. This would have cemented the small town into a living testament of sadistic nature without end. It is rumored that a group of townspeople were determined enough to prevent that from happening, and the house mysteriously burned down before the auction took place. And guess who was the chief fire marshal at the time? Frank Warden. The arson was not investigated and nothing was ever done. When Ed learned of the fire, he said just as well. Some believe this alluded to possible other crimes that were not known, or perhaps he just knew for whatever reason he was never going back there. The auction still happened, drawing a huge crowd of people, some to bid, some to just see for themselves. When Ed's 1949 sedan went on the block, it started a bidding war, and the purchaser went on to use it as a sideshow attraction. At its first viewing, labeled as the car that Ed Gein carried his victims in, it drew 2,000 people. But because of the indecency of the nature of it, the car was eventually barred from being displayed in Wisconsin. I kind of have a bit of an issue here. Oh, so did Pete. Here you have a guy who the townspeople made the butt of jokes and laughed at him, but they thought he was sus. It was also known that he had shrunken heads and face masks in his house and mishapen bowls. He told people about Mary Hogan and Travis Burgess' murder and burial location. He was bothering Bernice so much that Frank knew right away to blame Ed when she went missing, but no one did anything. And when his behavior could no longer be ignored and horrible things that he did were revealed, authorities took his word for the fact and blamed his mother. Ed was sent to Central State Mental Hospital for the criminally insane, a maximum security facility where he was a model patient. Docile, except for his full moon rowdiness. He had no meds and no visitors, but he would eventually be able to roam the grounds free. And with fan letters, even love letters from women, and the positive personnel at the facility, he finally had the positive attention he craved. His life was free of worries, living an institutional life, no bills, no stress. He was provided electricity, heat, water, meals, TV, radio, medical care, and a library, which he actually complained he didn't have enough material on Nazi atrocities in the South Sea headhunters. I kid you not. But all this suited Ed just fine, considering how he was living in squalor on his own. He even got to use his creative energy and fine needle experience by making jewelry and rugs. He still made women on the staff uncomfortable, though. By the time 1968 rolled around, Ed was fat and happy, and the doctors found that he was sane and fit to stand trial for Bernice's murder. The trial lasted 1 week. The evidence, prints, ballistics, and all the horrible findings were insurmountable. There were throngs of spectators, mostly women and newspaper reporters. People were surprised to see him in person because of his harmless-looking old man demeanor. They could not imagine a quiet man having committed crimes that shocked the world. Ed still claimed to have no memory of the events that occurred in November 1957. It was observed that when he was on the stand and given a picture of Bernice Worden when she was found that night, he stared at the photo as others would have stared at a Playboy centerfold. He was found guilty of murder because of his actions after the murder, but found insane at the time of the crime, and he was sent back to the mental institution. In 1974, 17 years after the murder of Bernice, Ed filed a petition with the Waushara County Clerk of Courts, claiming that he had recovered his mental health and was fully competent. He felt there was no reason why he should remain in any hospital. I can only imagine that the days of people treating him kindly, as they were professionals and that was their job, and the lack of stress to take care of himself gave him a sense that he could be fine outside the institution. He didn't think people would treat him any differently because they knew what he did. Did he consider what he would do for work or to support himself? Where would he live? He said he felt trapped and wanted to move to a big city. One of the doctors that examined him felt that he was too volatile and easily agitated when having to discuss past events. Ed even said things I found threatening about the doctors. He blamed psychiatrists for problems in the world because of digging up the past. Ed thought they may get burned up by bringing up the past and said, "I think a lot of prisoners from here may go out and kill them, rob them, club them because of digging up the past." One dumbass doctor suggested a less restricted institution. Other doctors thankfully opposed this idea, stating that it would give Ed access too easily to women that he could potentially harm. It was also evident that his mental stability had deteriorated over the years, and his hostility was more present. After review of his petition and testimony from the doctors, the judge denied his request and noted the irony that if Ed had pleaded guilty to the murder of Bernice initially, he would have been eligible for parole by this time, if he had received a life sentence. In 1978, Ed was sent to Mendota Mental Health Institute, where after becoming senile, he was later diagnosed with lung cancer. He died in 1984 of respiratory and heart failure at the age of 77. He was laid to rest next to his mother and Henry at the cemetery in Plainfield, although he would enjoy a peace that he did not grant to the women he had dug up for his needs. Of course, Ed's actions had a tremendous impact on the world's view of the unlimited depths of deviancy. His case influenced culture, books, comic books, movies, and music. He was the first example of the indescribable horror. His actions captured the monstrous and unspeakable possibilities of humanity, fueling Richard Bloch's book Psycho, and then the movie directed by Alfred Hitchcock. He was the inspiration behind the Leatherface character in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and even more accurately Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. There was even a musical movie, and merch that is sold to this day, t-shirt, mugs, and birthday cards. And then there are the jokes, adjusted for the current times. What did Ed Gein make his mattress out of? Mammary foam. What is Ed Gein's favorite restaurant? Chick-fil-A. On November 20th, 1957, a service was held for Bernice Worden in Plainfield. All the stores and offices were closed so locals could attend and pay respects to Bernice's family and friends. Before the service, the open gold casket was surrounded by flowers and closed when service began. Bernice had been a widow with 2 children, 4 grandchildren, 4 siblings, and 230 people were in attendance at the Methodist Church, in which the pastor began with Psalms 23. He wanted to remind the locals to have faith. God hasn't abandoned us in the face of horrific events. In 1962, all the human material found on Gein's property, including bones found in 1960, 3 years after Gein's arrest, were reburied without further investigation. However, with still having bones found years later and no real closure to the possibility of there being other crimes that Ed may have committed, it leaves one to wonder if all the remains were just 2 murders and grave robbings, or did Ed Gein have other secrets he never told? So, my lovelies, what have we learned today? Number 1, if you get a funny feeling in your gut about someone or something, let's not ignore it. Number 2, make sure you know where your meat is coming from. Number 3, if you see a skin mask hanging from the wall of a local odd guy's house, for fuck's sake, say something, and don't eat anything he offers. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions down below. I'm always interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you for watching, and be safe. Sending you silver streaks of wisdom.